What's going on, YouTube? This is Venomous Media, back with another video. Now, when it comes to live-action Marvel comic movies, some might be some of the coolest movies you have ever seen, while some might be some of the worst you've ever seen. In 2008, we saw the birth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was Marvel's first real attempt at a live-action shared universe, featuring their comic book characters. After Marvel had finally gained the live-action rights back to them, after selling them off due to their financial problems in the 90s. Now, once upon a time, something like this only seemed possible in the animated universe. Anyway, after nearly 20 years, the MCU has given us over 50 projects, and has become part of pop culture history. It's almost impossible these days for somebody to not talk about the MCU. However, before we got where we are today with the MCU, there were many adaptations of Marvel properties in film and television, going back to 1944. With a Captain America movie, we would also see live-action attempts at both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. The only one that really seemed to find any kind of success was the Hulk TV series. We wouldn't really get any home runs in the film department until we got Blade in 1998, which starred Wesley Snipes, followed by the first X-Men movie in 2000, and then Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. And all three of these movies did have a successful sequel, as well as sequels that are considered not so great. Anyway, these three were truly the first successful Marvel films. And of course, there were other characters around the time that tried, and sadly didn't have their success. In my opinion, though, not all of them were bad, and one of them is the subject of today's video. I'm talking about the 2004 Punisher film. Now, before I get started on this retrospect, I'd like to remind all of you that in my previous video, I said that the Punisher was one of my favorite comic book characters. You can go check that one out if you haven't already. Anyway, as far as Punisher films go, we have gotten 3 so far. And I'm honestly one of the few that actually likes all of them. To me, they were fun action flicks. And of course, I agree with most people that Warzone was the best in terms of violence and action. However, I do think the 2004 film is actually a great and underappreciated pre-MCU Marvel comic movie. Of course, opinions have been divided by comic fans about the 2004 Punisher, but most agree that Thomas Jane was perfect casting, and he's up there with Ray Stevenson and John Bernthal. Anyway, why don't we dive right into this? So, notable among the cast, we already know Thomas Jane plays the titular hero. There's also John Travolta, and Rebecca Romijn, who was actually playing Mystique in the X-Men movies around the same time. The movie also has a strong, notable supporting cast, which included Will Patton, Laura Herring, a young Ben Foster, Samantha Mathis, Roy Schneider, and my favorite addition of the cast, Vinny Vega, Big Daddy Cool himself, Diesel, Kevin Nash. Now, the movie does take inspiration from the Welcome Back Frank series by Garth Ennis, but ultimately does take some liberties, and I'll get into that in just a bit. But first, I just want to talk about the premise real quick. In this movie, Frank Castle is an FBI agent who's undercover doing a deal, and he fakes his death when the man who sets up the deal, Bobby Saint, is killed. Bobby Saint is the son of Howard Saint, a notorious crime figure based in Florida. After hearing about his son's death, Howard wants blood, and that's when he starts doing some digging and manages to shake down an FBI agent with a gambling problem who actually worked on the case and learns that Frank Castle was involved when his son was killed, and then he tried to fake his death afterwards. We then see Frank Castle in Puerto Rico with his wife Maria, son Will, his parents, and the entire Castle clan, having a family reunion to celebrate Frank retiring from the FBI. Frank's son Will gives him a black t-shirt with a skull, which kind of hints at things to come. Anyway, sadly the fun doesn't last long as Howard Saint manages to track down the Castle clan. Originally he just wants to kill Frank, but his wife Livia tells him to kill them all, and that's what they do. Frank and his father attempt to fight some of the goons, but they are overpowered, and his father's killed. Maria and Will attempt to escape, but sadly they don't get far, and are taken out by Howard Saint and his men. Finally, after coming face to face with Frank Castle, they put some bullets in him, and then there's an explosion. So Howard Saint and his men leave Puerto Rico thinking they're victorious and celebrate that they avenged his son's death. However, what Saint and his men didn't know is that Frank Castle is very much alive, and after recovering, he vows vengeance against Howard Saint and his men for killing his entire family. Now that I've given you the plot, I want to discuss the source material. As I mentioned before, this takes inspiration from Welcome Back Frank. If you're familiar with that storyline, you'll catch the references like the popsicle scene, and even the fight with the Russian looks similar. However, there are some key characters missing in the movie from that storyline, which includes Detective Soap and Von Richthofen. Also, the Nucci family. If you remember in the comics, Frank takes them all out in a zoo, and Ma Nucci's dismembered by animals but still alive, but Frank later finishes her off in her mansion when it's set on fire. However, all these characters do appear in the video game based on the movie, and I'll get to that one later on. Also missing is the Vigilante Squad, which consisted of the Holy, Payback, and Elite, 3 psychotic vigilantes who are inspired by the Punisher and want to join forces with him. And spoilers, they never get the chance. More liberties taken is that Frank Castle is an FBI agent. Now, the mainstream version of Frank Castle isn't in law enforcement, but the ultimate version is. Also, Punisher's a military veteran, and his background isn't mentioned at all in the film. But the novelization, a comic retelling of the movie, the video game, and even 2 versions of the script close to the final film do reference his military background, which state he's a staff sergeant and was in the Green Beret. So we can count him as having a military background in the movie, since official media tied to this movie reference his military background. Also, Frank doesn't have a son named Will. He has a son named Frank Jr. and also has a daughter named Lisa. Also, his parents in the comics are named Mario and Luisa Castiglione, not Frank Sr. or Betty. And of course, in the comics, Frank and his family are caught in the crossfire of a mob hit while on a family picnic, which Frank was the sole survivor, rather than being the sole survivor of a slaughter at a family reunion. And the movie takes place in Florida instead of his home turf of New York. And there's a production reason for that. According to an interview with Thomas Jane that I learned about from Matt McMuscle's What Happened to the 2004 Punisher movie, the movie takes place in Florida because that's where John Travolta was living at the time, and he didn't want to leave the state, so production took place in Florida just to accommodate him. Of course, Howard Satan replaces Billy Russo, aka Jigsaw. So yeah, they do take quite a few liberties, and I'm a purist when it comes to comic material, but in my opinion, none of this really hurts the movie. I think the fact that Punisher's entire bloodline being wiped out was actually a brilliant change. It makes him more vengeful, and it adds to the intensity. It wasn't a change that was too crazy or complicated to pull off, because we still ultimately get what we need from the Punisher as far as his character goes. Now onto the action. I really love the action in this movie. Like, seriously, I loved his tactics and all the weapons he used. In addition to firearms, he uses explosives, knives, and a freaking crossbow. Also, Frank is shown to be great at manipulation, and it has awesome results with his enemies.
You should really learn to pay your parking tickets.
Here's a fun and kind of scary fact about the fight scene with the Russian. Somehow, Big Daddy Cool was actually stabbed with a real knife. Apparently, the crew forgot to replace any real knives there with fake ones. Kevin Nash deserves all the credit in the world for selling that scene. It's amazing that he stayed in character for as long as he did, but given his pro wrestling background, I'm sure he's used to selling, even when injured. And surprisingly, he was actually really cool about getting stabbed. All he asked for as an apology was a pack of beer. Anyway, as far as the acting goes, I think everybody did a great job. My only true complaint is some of the characters could have been fleshed out a little more, like Rebecca Romijn's character Joan. It honestly feels like she comes and goes. I mean, her performance is fine, but I wish they did more with her. Also, Howard Saint is a generic crime boss that doesn't really stand out, to be honest, but Travolta does a good job with what he's working with. And I want to mention I really like the Russian in this movie, because let's be honest, in the comics, he's very cartoonish. At least Kevin Nash was able to make him look badass, to tone down some of the campiness associated with the character. Also, the soundtrack had a lot of bangers from some of the hottest bands at the time, like Trapped, Drowning Pool, Finger 11, Hatebreed, Puddle of Mud, Seether along with Amy Lee, and Nickelback. Speaking of Finger 11, if you're a pro wrestling fan, you will recognize Slow Chemical.
Comes Kane, walking with a purpose.
And sadly, the movie was not a hit at the box office, having a budget of $33 million, and only making around 54. Despite this, Thomas Jane was contracted for sequels, working on a script which would have taken Punisher to New York and eventually do battle with Jigsaw. Among the directors that were considered for the sequel were John Dahl, who you may know from Joyride, which starred Paul Walker and Steve Zahn, Walter Hill, who made The Warriors, and the 48 Hour movies with Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy. And of course Rob Zombie, fresh off The Devil's Rejects. Unfortunately, the sequel with Jane didn't happen, as he pulled out due to creative differences, the budget being cut, and Walter Hill being passed on as the director, who Jane really wanted to direct the sequel. Jane was quoted as saying he didn't want to do a movie he didn't believe in. That would be a disservice to all the fans. However, Thomas Jane did get a little closure as the Punisher, as he got to reprise the role not once, not twice, but 3 times. The first being in the video game, which was a combination of the movie, Welcome Back Frank, and Punisher Max. In my opinion, as of 2024, it's still one of the best comic book games around, and it's a real crime we haven't gotten a more modern Punisher game, and I doubt we will, for obvious reasons. Then Jane got to do a short film called Punisher Dirty Laundry, which was honestly his love letter to the character and fans, and it showed he can still pull off the Punisher. And finally, he made a cameo as the Punisher in Robot Chicken. After the 2004 film, we got Punisher Warzone, which was supposed to be the start of a film series based on the Punisher Max comics. And like I said, most of us fans loved Warzone because of the action and gore, as well as Ray Stevens' portrayal of the character. And sadly, Ray Stevens tragically passed away at 59 last year. Also, Warzone was a bigger flop than the 2004 film, but eventually Marvel and Disney regained the rights, and we saw John Berthel debut as Punisher in Season 2 of Daredevil, which he honestly nailed the role, and eventually got his own series, which in my opinion wasn't very good. I much preferred his appearance on Season 2 of Daredevil than his actual show, but that's a discussion for another day. And of course, the Punisher show was cancelled after 2 seasons, when Netflix's deal with Marvel came to an end, and all their future shows would be on Disney+. And more connected to the MCU, Punisher really does seem cursed when it comes to cancelled movies and TV shows, but John Berthel is at least coming back to the role in Daredevil Born Again, and is rumored to be getting a solo series not long after. But will it be any good? Will it be an improvement over the first attempt at a Punisher show? We can only hope. One more note about Thomas Jane and John Berthel is that Jane has actually expressed interest in directing a Punisher movie starring him, which honestly would be a great passing of the torch in my opinion. That's all I wanted to say for this video. Tell me down below what you think of the 2004 Punisher movie. Did you like it? Did you hate it? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? What do you think of Thomas Jane? Who's your favorite Punisher actor? And what's your favorite Punisher movie? Are you excited to see John Berthel return to the role? Would you like to see Jane direct him in a movie? Let me know down below. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. This is Venomous Media signing off.